Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. I got a really good viewer comment and it was a suggestion for a video in yesterday's video that I did. So I thought I would touch base on this comment because I think it's one that a lot of people probably have questions on. And that has to do with the angle of the line tie. If you check out any jigs, any hooks, no matter what hook is made, there is a degree to the line tie. So the line tie is actually the bend from the shank of the hook to where you tie the line onto the hook. Some of those, like this one, for instance, this is our core tackle hover rig, is a 90-degree hook. So if I take the flash tricks off, you can see the line tie is directly at a 90 degree to the shank of the hook. And then other hooks are straight shank, meaning there is no actual offset. It's just straight shank to hook eye. So every hook that's made has a degree regarding where the line tie is in respect to the shank of the hook. So the viewer question had to do with how do you know what is the right line tie to choose? What is the difference? Why does a 90-degree differ from a 30-degree? And how do you go about choosing the right line tie? And I thought to myself, this is a really good topic, and it's one we could talk about for a long period of time. But I figured I would touch base on the main differences, and I think this will probably help the viewer get a better feel for which line ties are going to be better for them as a whole. Generally speaking, the line tie issue is something that not only do the anglers have to choose from, the bait makers as well have to choose what degree line tie is the best for the bait and what they're trying to accomplish with the products they're making. Something I'm very familiar with core tackle. We've gone through a lot of different prototypes with different jig hooks with different degrees on them, specifically trying to find out which one has the best performance. And the hard part with that is you have to understand that each line tie degree has its own strengths. And if you want to achieve one thing, you should go with a certain degree. If you want to achieve something else, you should try to go with a different degree. The reality is, you're never going to be able to make the bait do everything you want because you can only choose one line tie angle for the bait that you're making. So let's just kind of talk about the differences. So let's take the 90-degree, like I just showed you, wherever that went. So the 90-degree, like this guy right here, this is our hover rig. So the reason we went with a 90-degree is twofold. First and foremost, this bait, we want to have more movement in the water. And generally speaking, the more you can move the line tie back in a jig head, the more that bait's going to sit horizontal. And if you got a bait that's horizontal in the water column, that's actually going to allow that bait to have some movement on its own. Just based on keeping the bait horizontal or trying to keep the bait horizontal, the bait's going to glide more than fall straight up and down in the water. If you're fishing something like this jig right here, that's a straight line tie. So you can see it's a straight line tie. This is made for punching grass. This jig, if I threw this out, is going to fall nose down because of that line tie angle. So the first thing you have to keep in mind is the degree of that line tie is going to allow the bait to sit differently. A 90-degree is going to try to keep that bait more horizontal in the water column versus a 0-degree or a low degree, a 30-degree or a 90-degree is generally going to fall nose down because the line tie is at the front of the bait. So all the weight is behind that line tie. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. Now, the 90-degree is the least weedless bait that you can throw. And the reason for that is you've got a straight flat edge from that line tie. So if you have a 90-degree, this is generally not going to come through cover nearly as well. So if you have if you're fishing through a lot of grass, you're not going to want that. You're going to want something like this jig, which is made for punching, where it's going to go right down through the grass and come through the grass line tie first. You don't necessarily want a bait in heavy cover to come through the cover, not with the eye first, because that eye is going to hit, it's going to roll the jig. It just becomes difficult to pull the bait through. A lot of times you can get snagged, say, in a brush pile, and it's not even because you've got the hook stuck. It's simply your line is got a branch that's pinned right here, so you can feel it. So you can, let the bait fall. It'll fall down into that brush. You can pull it up. It'll hit that limb and stop. You can yo-yo it in that tree, and it's simply because that line tie angle is making it hard for the bait to come through the cover. If you're throwing a 30 degree or a 0 degree, it's coming through straight through, so your line is parallel from the hook shank or the hook shank all the way to your rod tip. So it's coming straight through the cover. Generally speaking, your really heavy grass baits, your really heavy, thick cover baits are generally a 30 degree or less. Swim jigs, generally a 30 degree. Your heavy flipping baits, 0 degree. That's just how it is because you want something to pull through the cover. So you got to keep in mind, if you're fishing heavy cover, you might want to throw a lower degree hook versus, say, a 60 or 90 degree hook. Definitely an important thing to keep in mind. Now, if you're fishing really deep water, that again is where you're better off going with more of a 90 degree. And this has to do again with your weight being transferred a little bit in front of the hook eye as well as in back of the hook eye. What that's going to do is it's going to keep your bait riding more horizontal in the water. So when you're pulling up on it, if your bait's down in 20 feet, you can envision your line is going from the bait to the boat. It wants to pull your bait up. But if you have more weight transferred evenly around that hook eye, it's going to want to ride a little bit more horizontal in the water column. If you're throwing a 30 degree and it's down 20 feet deep and you start that retrieve, it's going to want to pull straight up towards your rod tip. That's just how it is. Now, in either case, you got to do things to keep your bait deep, but the reality is a 90 degree jig head will help you have a bait that stays deeper and at the same time stays more horizontal versus a 30 degree. If you start reeling it in 20 feet of water, it's gonna turn from horizontal and it's going to come straight at the boat because it's nose first. The hook eye is leading the way per se. So from that standpoint, if you're looking at fishing really deep cover, definitely a bonus to go with a 90 degree versus going with a 30 or 0 degree. It's generally just more, it just works better in deeper water. It just tends to run more horizontal and stay even keel. And then the last thing just to keep in mind is how your bait sits in the water. We kind of touched on this, but if you're throwing a 90 degree, your bait's going to want to sit. You can see it. Your bait is sitting a little bit more horizontal versus if I were just to grab, here's a 30 degree, you can see how up and down that is because you've got the hook eyes at the front part of the bait. So this is a core tackle swim jig, completely beaten and abused. And then with the hover rig, with the 90 degree, it's sitting at like a 45 in the, as I'm just holding it here versus the swim jig, which is basically sitting, uh, just straight vertical. That's just the difference. So if you're looking for a presentation to sit more horizontal in the water column, a lot of times you're better off going with that 90 degree. The other thing to say with that is you tend to get more motion out of your bait, like I said, out of a 90 degree because your bait is more horizontal, which can allow the bait to move more. So it's one of those things where ideally you'd love to have a bait that did all of that, right? You'd love to have a bait that came through cover, stayed deeper when you wanted to stay deeper, sat more horizontal in the water column when you wanted it to, had more gliding motion. The reality is you can't achieve that with one hook eye. So from that standpoint, it really is up to the angler to try to determine what degree hook to choose under the circumstances that they're fishing. For me, if I'm dragging a football jig, I'll throw a 90 degree because I like that better. I think I get better feel. I think I have better contact with the bottom, and I want my bait to stay deep on the bottom. If I'm flipping really shallow cover or I'm throwing a swim jig through shallow pads and heavy cover, I'm going to go with a 30 degree swim jig because I don't want that 90 degree getting hung and every pad stem it hits or every lay down log it hits. So you can't have both, but it's really valuable to the angler to understand the difference so that you can choose the correct bait based on the circumstances that you're fishing. So hopefully this was helpful. Like I said, we could talk about this for a long time, and it's something I've put way more thought into lately with core tackle just because we're trying to choose the correct hook with respect to every design we come out with. And it can get frustrating because you want this and you want this, but you can only have one. And I think the anglers feel the same way. Anyways, if you enjoyed today's video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and stay tuned. We'll have a new video coming out tomorrow for you.